Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you all to this discussion on the rights of children in America. I am Joe Waters, the co-founder and CEO of CAPITA. CAPITA is a Greenville, South Carolina-based think tank started in 2018 as a creative space to explore how the great cultural and social transformations of our day affect young children, and to tackle the many interrelated problems that prevent us from taking a holistic and effective approach to meeting the needs of children and families, particularly those furthest from opportunity. Through published analysis and commentary, private seminars and workshops, public meetings and convenings, and direct consultations, we catalyze creative new solutions to pressing challenges and provide foresight to leaders shaping a future in which children and families can develop to realize their full potential in a just, peaceful, prosperous society on a sustainable planet. I'm grateful to Elliot Haskell for helping to organize this conversation in collaboration with his semi-monthly newsletter, The Parents Aren't All Right. If you're not subscribed, you can subscribe at capita.org. I'm also grateful to our distinguished panelists who have taken time here at the busy beginning of the academic year to engage with us in a conversation that is urgently imposed by the pandemic, the systemic racial injustices that have been made more apparent to us in recent years, and by the treatment of children on our borders, in our justice system, in our child welfare systems, and in institutions that have enabled the abuse and trafficking of children. Children's rights are human rights, and human rights have their source in the unique dignity of the human person. Today's conversation will focus on the need to enshrine children's rights in law and the mechanisms for doing so. The legally enshrined rights of children are an indispensable predicate, one we have long ignored in the United States, for fostering and promoting, beginning in the earliest years of life, the human dignity that is the foundation of justice, peace, equality, and security. It is my hope that today's conversation moves us further down the path of recognizing the fundamental human dignity of every child, enshrining that legally here in the United States, and on that basis, taking more effective steps in policy, systems, and institutions of all sizes and at all levels across the country to promote the well-being and flourishing of our children, which is the foundation of a just, peaceful, prosperous society on a sustainable planet for which CAPITA works. I'll turn things over now to Elliot Haskell to moderate today's discussion. Elliot?
Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks to all the panelists for being here. So I'll just say briefly, I got really interested into this topic of children's rights because I work primarily in the field of childcare, and in the U.S. childcare, children have basically no rights in that space. There's no right to childcare, whereas there is. And I started my career as a public school teacher. In all 50 state constitutions, a right to public education, and that really is interesting. I think when we talk a lot about intervening for children flourishing, often we go to the levers of programs and policies. When we think about this, we don't often talk in a rights-based language, and it's really just not part of the discourse often. When we think about the United States and when we think about levers for change, it's not often one of the things we reach to. We reach to much more, again, policy and start a program. And so we thought that'd be really good to start a conversation about what is the state of children's rights in America? How does that compare to some of our peer nations? And what does that make us think? And I think by the end of this conversation, I hope to get to the sort of thought exercise, but also kind of what I almost consider the holy grail, which is, there are no federal rights for children. Should a children's amendment be something that we're thinking about? And so I'm excited to dig into that, and I really want to reserve most of this time for these distinguished guests. I'm going to just briefly give the titles of our guests. If you want to learn more about their bios, you can go look on the event page, but I want to maximize the time we have to talk about the content. So I'm thrilled to be joined by these folks. So Danielle Holly-Walker is the Dean and Professor of Law at Howard University School of Law. Kimberly J. Robinson is a Professor of Law and a Professor of Education at my alma mater, the University of Virginia, Wahoo Wah. Jessica Dixon Weaver is a Professor of Law at Southern Methodist University, and then Jonathan Todris is a Professor of Law at Georgia State University. So thank you all for joining us. And so I wanted to start, Dean Holly-Walker, with you, because I think it's important to get started with terminology. And so I'm not a lawyer. I have no background in law. And so it seems to me that rights kind of sort of show up in two ways. One is there's this kind of like right that a given group can sort of access. So I think about like women's suffrage there, like that's the access to the vote. And then I think about rights where the government is obligated to provide something. So again, like the right to education, the government has to make sure that there's a public education spot for you. So when we talk about children's rights, like what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about children's rights, we're really thinking of the things that they have a remedy for, right? So when we think about rights, there has to be a remedy for those rights. So these are things that government is obligated to do, right? And so when we think of the full realm of children's rights, you can start all the way at the ability to just be secure in their own person. So anything that talks about a right to basically be free of abuse, have basic needs met in terms of not being neglected, et cetera. Then we can move out further to thinking about things like healthcare, where we know that children do not have a right to healthcare in this country. And also my area of study, which is education, where we know that children do not have a federal right to education, and that most of the rights that we talk about in terms of right to public schooling are enshrined in our state constitutions. And so I think one of the reasons why this discussion is really important around rights in particular is that without rights, there really is no way to ensure uniformity. So one of the things I think that we're seeing come out as part of the COVID crisis that we're experiencing is every student, depending on their state, depending on their school district, depending on the locale where they live, is offered different things from a child who may be even just 100 miles away, right? So I think that that part of the rights framework, this notion of being a person who lives within the boundaries of the United States, would entitle children to a certain type of rights, where we think about healthcare, whether we think about education, whether we think about welfare, kind of basic state of welfare, meaning security from all of the things that we see that have to do with child poverty, knowing that child poverty rates in the United States are way too high. All of those things come down to this rights framework, because we see that our current framework, which really installed these mostly at the state level, is not working well for our children and is allowing a continuous state of poverty, little education, unfunded education, and too many differences in terms of what are available for children in the United States. So I think the conversation about rights and what is government obligated to do, and specifically what are the federal obligations as to children, it is a very important conversation that we're entering into today.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really helpful context. And so, Professor Tadros, that makes me then sort of ask, I know you sort of think about this also sort of in the international context. So how do the legal rights of children in America compare to those in other, so-called developed nations?
Yeah, so I want to just say thank you to you and Joe for hosting this event. I think these conversations are really important. We live in an era where highly charged rhetoric seems to be the sort of standard, and it's important that we create these spaces where we can have more thoughtful dialogue on really important issues. I want to just make one clarifying point before I jump in, and that is, I think when we talk about the law, we should distinguish between the law on the books and its implementation and enforcement. I think sometimes the law can be strong, but then it's not enforced. And the problem really is enforcement, not that we necessarily need new law. With that backdrop, as Dean Hollywalker mentioned, the US Constitution and federal law focuses primarily on civil and political rights. So the children in the United States have access to and a variety of civil rights protections. Again, to be clear, some still suffer rights violations. That's sort of law on the books versus sort of law on day-to-day basis. But the focus really is at the federal level, civil and political rights. And so there's lots we could say and get into the weeds on how we compare to other wealthy nations. But the biggest difference is that the US Constitution and federal law are essentially silent on economic, social, and cultural rights. So many other countries of similar wealth establish healthcare as a right. Here it is not at the federal level. Now, we do have programs such as Medicaid and CHIP that ensure a number of children have access to some healthcare. But importantly, there's no right to those programs. And what that means in practice is that the government can at any time decide to cut back on those programs, end those programs. And to Dean Holly Walker's point, there's no remedy then. Those programs, they're given at the will of the government and they can be taken away. Without a right to healthcare, there's no real claim to a remedy in those instances or claim to the actual services that underlie the right. The same with the right to education that exists in other countries. And so there are also differences in the civil and political rights context, but the biggest difference really is with respect to health, education, and other economic and social rights. And importantly for children, those are really the building blocks of child well-being, and we don't ensure them in the United States.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And then, I think to drill down on that one of education, which has come up a few times. So Professor Robinson, this is really something you're also, in your field of study. So what are the consequences for American children of the fact that there is not a federal right to education, although it does exist in the state constitutions?
Yeah, so this is really critically important. I think sometimes people are surprised they actually don't have a right to education when you tell people that. But what it means is exactly what Dean Holly Walker said, which is that you do not have a remedy for any differences in really equity or accuracy in education. I will say, because of a case called Plyler versus Doe, if you completely shut children out of school, the United States Supreme Court has said you cannot, just close off the opportunity to attend school at all. But that's merely the ability to enter the door. That what's provided within those four walls is entirely left to state law and discretion and state politics. And so because of that, the consequences are that we have a system that is very out of line with the rest of developed nations, which is that we give less funding typically to low-income communities and children in their schools, whereas other developed nations have read the research, which is really, there's a strong research consensus that investing more in disadvantaged communities allows those children to better compete on a level playing field with their peers. And so other nations follow that evidence and get far better results. We invest more in more affluent children, and so we leave behind many children. And so this is a problem for not just the children who are left behind in their communities, it's a problem for the entire nation. It's we underinvest in many communities of color, low-income communities, English learners. And so because of that, we pay the costs of, increased healthcare costs, greater criminal justice involvement, fewer taxes collected. It mounts up to millions of dollars and cumulatively in the billions. And so we pay it economically, we pay it in our democracy by not educating children to be engaged citizens. We do not have, well prepared citizens to go and vote in the ballot box and vote in their interests. And so it's really, we could really spend the rest of the time talking about what are the costs of not having this, because it is left to state politics and state courthouses who have not effectively promoted equity and adequacy. And so because of that, children are left to the will of politics.
Yeah, that's I think very sober analysis. And so I think before we move on to Professor Dixon Weaver, just one other sort of clarification point. Can you talk about the distinction between a right that is granted or an entitlement that's granted legislatively by the Congress versus something that actually happens through the Constitution at the federal level?
Yeah, I can explain that distinction, sure. So it really depends on, so rights granted by the Constitution typically are enforceable in federal court. So for example, your right to equal protection. You can go into court and say, I was intentionally discriminated against in violation of the Constitution. However, when Congress creates a right, not all of those rights can you go to court. There's not always a private right of action to go to court. So there are many private rights of action that Congress creates, but not all of them involve the ability to go to court. And so, we can discuss, perhaps in Q&A, the benefits and costs of that. there are ways to advance education that would, use maybe a right of action as a last resort after the states have had a chance to sort of move forward on greater education, equity, and adequacy. But ultimately, you have to be able to hold states accountable. And if you cannot hold them accountable through a private right of action, you don't get a result. And so that's sort of the basic difference.
That's helpful. Thank you for those of us who are the lay people out here. And then Professor Dixon Weaver, I think when I sort of think about children's rights, there can be a tension that's lifted up between children's rights and parents' rights. And this, I think particularly comes up when you think about the sort of right of a minor to access certain services. Sort of abortion is one example, gender confirmation, surgery would be another example. And so sometimes when I started these conversations with folks around children's rights, that kind of jars to a halt when we get to what happens when those clash. So can you talk about how we sort of can think about the tension between children's rights and parents' rights? And you're muted.
One of us had to do that, right? So usually when I teach my students about parents' rights and children's rights, we talk about them sort of imposition or as compared to the right of the state to, control or interfere with the family. And so obviously children are connected to parents. And so generally speaking, our laws provide that parents have the right to care, custody, and control over children. I call those the 3 C's. And generally that means that they have the right to raise their children as they see fit. And there's an assumption that parents act in the best interest of their children, so that whatever the parent's decision is, whether it's, where they go to school, what doctor they go to, whether they're, immunized or not, that they're acting in their child's best interest. However, there can be instances where the state will intervene in order to protect children. And so if they're at risk of being abused or neglected, then the state can intervene into the family's sort of their right to privacy or their right to family integrity in order to protect that child. When we think about sort of the tension between parents' rights and children's rights, we know that generally speaking, the Constitution allows under the U.S. Bill of Rights, certain rights for adults, right? The right to marry, the right to bear children, the right to privacy, their First Amendment rights. And then there's really the question as to, well, do children have these same rights? And when do they have these rights? And generally states have what they call sort of status laws that allow for children once they reach a certain age to be able to, drive, to marry, to smoke. And so the things that we associate with the ability to make competent decisions, there usually is an age for that. But prior to reaching that age of majority, generally speaking, the parents would have the right to make those decisions for children. And there have been some carving out of rights for children. So a famous case is the Tinker case, which allows for children to have freedom of expression in schools. But since that case, there haven't been many other cases that have allowed children to exercise First Amendment rights in places that are controlled by the state. When we think about the right to abortion and the right to have a child, generally speaking, it varies depending on the state, but children do have the right to go to court if their parent does not approve of them having the abortion, because generally speaking, when children have any type of medical procedure, the parent has to approve or sign off on it. But that right to bear children is a right that has been recognized by the Supreme Court in the case Bellotti versus Baird. And that establishes that if a child can show that basically she's mature enough and well-informed enough in consultation with her physician to show that she understands what she's doing, and she can also show that it's in her best interest, then she can bypass her parents' approval and obtain a court order in order to obtain an abortion. So they're different, and that's typically considered to be what we call the mature minor doctrine, but it's not available across the board. And there are different cases that have addressed this with respect to, when does a child have the ability to make decisions for him or herself? With gender conformity, there's a wide range. There's actually an article that's coming out by Marie Amelie George called Exploring Identity. And it talks about sort of, how the court considers custody issues when with parents who are either supportive of gender exploration or identity exploration versus those who are not. And most of the time, what you see from courts is there's a focus on, well, what does the parent want or think is in their child's best interest, as opposed to what does the child want? And even to the extent that courts allow for children to have attorneys appointed, generally speaking, for custody matters, they're not always appointed regularly. They're appointed usually when a party requests, but it's not always granted. And so even with respect to having representation in court, children don't have representation across the board. And that poses difficulties for them being able to express what they want. And we generally don't have any kind of, rights with respect to children across the board where their expression or their sense of identity is confirmed and supported by a particular law. They're usually sort of, particular instances like abortion where there's a carve out or an exception to basically allow for children to have the right in that particular situation. But for the most part, the parent has the final say on many instances. If we have a chance in the Q&A, we can talk about immunization. I think there was an 18-year-old who testified before Congress about how he chose to get the vaccine, even though his mother did not want him to get the vaccine. And so just that juxtaposition between children, maybe reaching age majority or not, having a different position with respect to what they want to do with their own bodies.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And so one more specific question, then a few I want to throw open to everyone, and then we're happy to take Q&A. So yes, if any of you want to start, who are listening and want to start putting in questions in, we can take those in a little while. So Professor Tadros, I want to come back to you briefly. The US is, to my knowledge, the only UN member state to not have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child. And so can you talk a little bit about, first of all, why is that? And what would ratifying the convention do? What has that done for countries that have ratified?
Sure, you're correct. The U.S. stands alone in the world as the only country that has not accepted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We did sign the treaty, but we have not ratified the treaty, and it's ratification that gives it effect. And let me briefly highlight some of the reasons why. I think they fall into sort of two categories. One is this idea of this concerns around sovereignty. That is, the U.S. or some in the U.S. are concerned that ratifying a human rights treaty would somehow result in losing sovereignty. That's easily debunked because, in fact, the U.S. has ratified other human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and others. And it's had no adverse impact on our sovereignty. I think there's sort of a historical approach with the US where the US has long been supportive of the development of human rights treaties and far more reluctant to participate in them. A good example of that is the Genocide Convention. That seems like a pretty easy public stance to take, to say that you oppose genocide and crimes against humanity. And yet it took the United States 40 years, at 40 years to become a party to that treaty. So it's just partly the sort of historical habit of we support human rights, but we really view them as for others. The second bucket that is more complicated is really where Professor Weaver was speaking, which is the concern about parental rights. And this, unfortunately, has gotten swept up in much broader discussions about the rights of parents and families in the current political landscape. Because the reality is that in most instances, parental rights and children's rights are largely aligned. Most parents do not want their child to be discriminated against. Most denied access to education, do not want their child trafficked. There are lots of rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that parents and children are squarely on the same side. There are a few exceptions, and those need to be handled thoughtfully. But parental rights is often used sometimes with sort of really charged language and scare tactics to suggest that this would radically change things in the US. In fact, the US was arguably the most active participant in the drafting. There are 40 substantive provisions of the treaty. The US proposed had proposals and recommendations and revisions on 38 of the 40 provisions. This has the US stamp all over it. And as for the impact, you can think about the global impact. We've never had a human rights treaty reach universal ratification. So we're a little uncertain territory and the potential impact for that. But the global impact is really this. For lots of it would reestablish the US as a leader in the children's rights arena. Now, what you often hear, and I suspect it's the same for some of the others on the panel today, when I'm overseas and I talk about improving children's rights in a particular country, or I talk to my friends who work on these issues, the very first thing they often hear is, well, how can the US ask us to do more when it won't even participate? So we lose standing to say, no, you need to do better in that particular country. So that's one piece of it. The bigger piece is the impact in the US, because the reality is, and the structure of human rights treaties is that they impose obligations on governments to treat people subject to their jurisdiction a certain way. And there's one limitation with human rights treaties, not to get too into the technical weeds, but the US typically deems human rights treaties non-self-executing. And what we mean by that term non-self-executing is that when the US ratifies a treaty, it takes on international obligations. But domestically, for you to bring a claim in court and rely on that treaty, there needs to be domestic implementing legislation. And that's important, and it should give some comfort to those who are worried about what would happen, because it's Congress and the American people that ultimately decide what does that domestic implementing legislation look like. And the real power of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is that it provides a framework. It's a framework that establishes what the conditions are to ensure child well-being and to ensure that every child has an opportunity to develop to their full potential. That's not just good for children, that's good for our country.
Thank you. I'm ready to go ratify that now.
All right.
So as we sort of turn now more towards, okay, like this being the state of children's rights, what would it look like to sort of confirm more? So one kind of bridge question, which I think has come up somewhat recently, is this question of climate justice. So this is highly relevant, I think, right now as we're watching, everyone is Hurricane Ida, as we're watching the wildfires in California. And UNICEF released a report just last week or the week before saying that the climate crisis is a children's rights crisis. Yet I also know that in the US, relatively recently, there was the court case Juliana v. US, which was a children-led case, basically trying to force the government to take more action on climate change, which was dismissed. And so this is for any of you who want to answer, and I know this is still an emerging sort of area, but to what extent does sort of the lack of children's rights in America affect the sort of ability of children to fight for climate justice?
Well, I'll jump in briefly. As the only man on the panel, I really didn't want to be the first to speak and be that guy. So please cut me off if any of you want to go first. But I'll be very brief. I think there's both a legal piece to this and there's sort of a social piece to this. And the idea is that if you don't see children as rights holders, then you don't see you, meaning policymakers or others who have the ability to shape what our environment looks like today and going forward, then you don't see them as constituents that you have to respond to and have to account for. And children are going to feel the effects far more than anyone else of climate change, right? These 70-something-year-old politicians and billionaires, they don't have to look 30 years out because they probably, respectfully, won't be around in 30 years, right? Children will live with the consequences today, whether it's the wildfires, the tropical storms, hurricanes, and they will see that every single year for the next 70 years. So until we see them as rights holders, that are individuals who command respect and are entitled to being treated as if they have rights, and not some future becomings, then we're going to have a challenge making meaningful progress.
I would say, along with seeing children as rights holders, I think along with that goes the right to vote, right? Because they're really a constituency that they may have voice. So we've seen over the years, activism among children is not new. They were very active in the civil rights movement. In fact, it was the Birmingham Children's Crusade of 1963 that was sort of a catalyst within the civil rights movement. And there were many children who made the decision against their parents' wishes to march and to be a part of the civil rights movement when they could not vote. And we see that time and time again. We saw that with guns rights after many different shootings in schools. We see it with climate change. And there is some movement in different countries with respect to allowing children to vote at the age of 16 or 17, either in localized elections or national elections. So it's interesting that, the block of people that probably hold the most power and the most money are the older people that Jonathan or Professor Todros just talked about, who won't be here 30 years from now, to know what the earth looks like. But if we were to think about children as rights holders and also as voters, if they could vote at age 16, we allow children to do different things early on. And so I think one of the ways that we can perhaps reframe how we see children is seeing them as capable of extending the right to vote to them, to be able to make a decision as to who they want to represent them. They're quite capable with respect to analyzing these issues and thinking about the effect it has on them. And obviously, with respect to climate change, they are the ones who are most affected by what might happen 30, 40, 50 years down the line. So why wouldn't we think about extending a right to vote to at least those who have reached a particular age, perhaps 16 or 17, where we believe that they could competently cast a vote?
That's really helpful. Thank you.
One thing that's been interesting to me watching policy debates around special federal policy, special federal elections, so presidential elections or elections for senator and Congress, is how much rights that are specifically related to children have fallen by the wayside. So it used to be that you'd hear especially a lot of policy around education in the kind of national election cycle, and a lot of that has faded away. I think that the ability of children to reshape the political discourse around issues like climate change is going to be critical to us having effective policy in those areas. So children are raising their voices. And I think it is, especially considering the large number of their generation and how big they are in comparison to the US population overall, they're going to become more and more influential. And on these issues, I think their views in terms of what is possible in the policy realm is very different from the policy ideas that we see being battered around in the mainstream political discourse right now. So I think part of it is children have expectations related to climate change and lots of other things that I think we, the current group of adults who are governing, may not be nearly on the same page, because I think that they have ideas that in some ways in terms of policy are much more radical than the things that are currently considered to be in the political mainstream, so of course, Professor Dixon Weaver's suggestion that they vote a little bit earlier would be really, I think, earth-shaking for a lot of policy that we're talking about now, but I think particularly in the area of climate change.
Thank you. And there are a few questions coming in, which we'll get to in just a minute. And so I think a lot of them relate to, as we head to the back half of this conversation, the point about radical change. We think about lowering the voting age, and when I think about these rights that don't exist right now. So I guess the general question is, with this idea of a children's amendment to the United States Constitution, like, is this something that has been proposed in the past? Is this something that, to your knowledge, is kind of out there in the discourse? And how should we, sort of think about, and we're going to get into some more specifics here, but, if I say I think there should be a children's amendment to U.S. Constitution that enshrines certain rights, a right to, education, a right to care, a right to a livable climate, maybe, et cetera, et cetera. Is that, can you sort of talk about, has that been proposed in the past, and how should we think about that as a possible lever for change?
I think one of the challenges of that as a lever for change is not just the difficulty with the constitutional amendment process, it's just the getting agreement on multiple things, right? So if you're going to get an amendment, the Constitution passed, getting momentum around even a single right is challenging. And so the idea that you would get a full package enacted, I think, is a very difficult one. I'm not saying it's not worth, I think there are various reasons to think about, pushing such an agenda to raise the consciousness of lawmakers and policymakers about the needs and interests of children, and how they are treated and impacted by these laws and policies. However, I think in terms of an actual amendment that gets enacted, very difficult to package many different principles and interests together, because for each of those rights, you have different coalitions and different sets of opposition. And so people will oppose such an amendment in part because they oppose one part of it. This happened with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are parts of it that everyone agrees with, and there are parts of it that are just like, but no, if I can't do X, I'm going to oppose the whole thing. Right. And so it's the same thing with the children's amendment. I think that's a very difficult vehicle to fully protect the rights of children. I think, extending individual rights to children, legislation that protects children, as opposed to, I think people very much rely on programs for children, but those come and go. People can get rid of those very quickly. And so I think those avenues are just more fruitful for pursuing such policies.
If I can follow up there's a question here from Elias asking about, in terms of a national campaign, like what areas would be the most persuasive. So I know, Professor Robinson, you've written about education, you did Holly Walker as well. So, even if we just isolate to that, like a federal right to education, like, is that, one that's feasible, or do we see opposition to the idea of enshrining a federal right to education?
I mean, admittedly, absolutely, you would see opposition. I think there is growing support for this idea. I think as people see the deep divides that we have in education, the impact of that divide, the pandemic laid it bare and brought it home to you what the divide was. They teed it up for you and sent it home in a package, right? There's a huge divide happening. And so I think that's part of the challenge. So if you look at survey data about whether people think children are provided equal educational opportunity, there's a race and class divide. So many whites and more affluent families think, yes, all children get equal education opportunity. And if you ask more children of color, families of color, and low-income families, they say, no, we're not getting the same opportunities. So this survey data shows that, but the data about what the opportunities are is very clear, that they are not getting the same opportunities. And that's being worsened by the pandemic. And so this idea that there should be some foundational right for children for education, I think, is one that is growing, and that different coalitions that support children's rights and support education are beginning to gain greater interest in. So there's potential. I don't, getting it through such a divided Congress right now, I think is very difficult. And certainly getting it before the Supreme Court right now would be not a great idea. So I don't think, in the short term, that's possible, but I do think it's a far more fruitful avenue to move in the long term.
Thank you. And then, in terms of so we've been talking about the federal constitutions as well. I think, I'm curious about when you think about the sort of state constitutions, or even in some cases, local charters, something like city charters, like are those, also sort of thoughts about whether those might be more fruitful avenues given kind of the gridlock at the federal level. But I also know that in many cases, there's just less of a remedy there. I remember learning about all the times that Supreme Court in places like Kansas would be like, you're underfunding schools, and the legislature would be basically like, okay, we're not going to do anything about that. And so, because it's sort of the enforcement question we were talking about a little bit earlier. So can you talk about, how we should think about, or any thoughts on whether state or local governing documents are also worthy of consideration for amendment?
I was going to let others jump in since I've been talking a while.
I was going to say, I think that there can be some, some movement, or some steam behind certain localities or states considering, establishing rights for children. And similar to other laws that we have in our country, usually it's a tearing down of laws. Like, people have gotten rid of laws that have treated children or particular classes of persons differently or unequally. And as those states get rid of the laws, then we can sort of see a law and society loop where that particular law goes out of fashion or is not thought to be the prevailing or supported by society, then the law goes away. And oftentimes there might be a Supreme Court ruling on those particular types of laws that sort of take away rights. But as far as granting rights, there has been, at least internationally, certain locales that have granted the right to vote to children, sort of in a piecemeal way. And in some instances where you can study, well, what is the effect of this on participation in the politics or in the political arena. There's been some studies that show that it's actually been a positive thing because it engages children earlier, and it, at least with respect to how most parents are tied to their, or most children are tied to their parents, similar to what Professor Tadros says. So they may vote similar to their parents, or they may not, but it at least introduces them to sort of their citizenship rights and their obligations in as far as, participation in society. Like, what does the right to vote allow you to do if we were to have certain cities or states allow that to occur? Then we could see, from the perspective of some type of study, is this a positive or negative thing? I don't know, depending on what is the ruling party of that particular state or locale would probably dictate whether or not something like that would pass. And obviously, because we're so divided right now, it would seem that, there may not be bipartisan consensus on giving children the right to vote unless they think that it would be beneficial for one party or the other. And so it remains to be seen whether or not giving children the right to vote would actually change, how the outcome of a vote would be, because we don't really know, amongst children in both cities and rural areas where they fall and how aligned they are with their parents, and what activism or education or social media, all the things that they have at their fingertips that we might not have had as teens growing into adulthood, how that affects how they see the world. But I think it could be an interesting experiment to try to get a locale to give children the right to vote at a year or two earlier age, to see what would happen We could only see if momentum could be built in that way, but it would be very difficult to get a constitutional amendment, I think, passed, at least in general, even if there was bipartisanship occurring in Congress right now, but definitely where we are now will be difficult.
I think in terms of state and local rights for children, and specifically in the education area, I think of litigation like the Abbeville litigation in South Carolina, where, in 2014, the South Carolina Supreme Court found that the state was not meeting the minimally adequate standard under the state Supreme Court for education for children in that state. But after sending it to the legislature and letting the legislature try to figure out remedies for this finding of a violation of that constitutional standard, essentially in 2017, they threw up their hands and the South Carolina Supreme Court reversed their decision that the state was in violation of the state constitution on the basis of separation of powers, saying we don't have any ways, the court, to tell the legislature how to fund these rural schools and schools in general that were underfunded in South Carolina. So I think the serious limitations on kind of the way that the state constitutional rights in the education area are enforced has been, we've seen that over the course of the last 25 years as those adequacy lawsuits have played out across the country. And South Carolina is just one example of how those kinds of litigations have really not advanced the ball for rights for education, which is why I'm so strongly supportive of a federal right to education, and think that there are benefits, as Professor Robinson said, even beyond just passing the constitutional amendment. The discussion of the constitutional amendment, the federal constitutional amendment in itself, that possibility can drive states to maybe pay more attention to the state constitutional requirements that are currently on the books.
Yeah, I would just briefly add, I think others have sort of captured the constitutional amendment question. I think it would be really challenging. But that doesn't mean there's nothing left to do at the federal level. There's, there's action in terms of establishing federal rights. There's also building in institutional support at a federal level. We desperately need a cabinet level children's commissioner position. There's a bill that's been introduced that would call for agencies to do, child impact assessment in advance of regulatory steps. And so there are things we can do to raise the profile of children's issue and raise the profile of children at the federal level while we are simultaneously making the case for why we should recognize rights at the federal level. I think there's still plenty to do on the state and local level, as everyone's mentioned. A number of states and localities have adopted resolutions either calling for US ratification of the CRC, but more interestingly, several cities have adopted resolutions saying we will follow the principles of the CRC in our city council's work. I don't think those have really been evaluated in great depth to sort of fully appreciate the impact, but there's potential for some local progress. The challenge with that is, of course, we're in a really divided country, and some of the poorest areas of the country are in states where they would resist these efforts. And so some of those states are already, ranking 46, 47 on education, on child poverty, on a host of issues. And so while I wouldn't ever oppose progress in some areas, I think we should be careful about ceding too much to just states and localities, because you're going to end up with this checkerboard and growing disparities in places that are really left behind and don't have access to those sort of local rights-based initiatives.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, all of you. So with the last few minutes, and I also wanted to point out, yes, David Alexander noted that Oakland, California recently adopted a local ballot measure so their youth can vote in their school board members. And I think San Francisco came very close to passing one as well. So yes, there's some innovation happening there. And, I think your point about the idea of sort of a child rights commissioner is also really well taken. And Joe could probably drop into the chat. There was a conversation Capita did with the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner, I think they're called. And it's interesting, having that level of sort of someone whose job it is to think about the child well-being now and in the future. So with the last few minutes, I think when we think about sort of children's rights and any sort of movement to increase them, I'm curious what lessons we can learn looking back at the past. So I think of a few, right? So women's suffrage, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and the so far failed attempt to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. There have been these attempts throughout our history to enshrine more rights. And what sort of lessons could the sort of children's right movement, if you want to call it that, learn from these past movements in terms of how you do move public opinion, how you do, get to the understanding that the context is obviously different than when those things were happening?
So I'll mention one thing very quickly. What's striking to me when I look back at other movements is, at the end of the day, the success of the women's rights movement was driven by women. The success of the civil rights movement was driven by African Americans and other people of color, and so on. Ultimately, we have to make space for children to assume leadership roles in the children's rights movement. And that comes with challenges, right? There's, first of all, in most conversations about children, it's sort of this talk of children as this homogenous group. 16-year-olds and 6-year-olds are not the same, right? Let alone 6-month-olds, right? So it's a really diverse group that we're accounting for, but we have to Professor Dixon Weaver's point about, reducing the voting age, we have to make space for young people to lead. And they're showing this already, right? On climate change, on responses to gun violence, on civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement. There are young people who have been in leadership positions. And what we need to do is be allies in that and really help elevate them in the work they are doing.
Any other thoughts on that one?
I think an important lesson is that you're playing a long game. Like it's a long fight, right? The fight for civil rights, really began after the Civil War and continues to this day. And so the fight for children's rights is likely to be as long, if not longer, right? So I think you have to, move the ball forward. Don't ever rest. Like, even if you get a big win, don't sleep. Those rights can be rolled back very quickly. And so you want to just keep pressing forward and, sort of recognize given the urgency of the issues, that you have to, play the long game, because even victories can be undone. We saw that with Jim Crow, right? You got all these amendments, and then suddenly we went, really far backwards. So I think it's important to understand the need to stay vigilant. And I will say, one of the wonderful things about the Black Lives Matter movement now is that so many people are awakening to the fact that we have, racial inequality, racial injustice. It's like the thing that people were saying for so long. People are like, oh, wait, this is really happening. Yeah, it's been happening, but now it's part of the conversation, right? There's a whole generation of young people now who are growing up realizing that racial inequality is pervasive. That's a very different mindset from what, many children in my generation, when we were kids, we were often told like the civil rights movement was very successful and we won great equality and now you have these opportunities, right? But what we all came to realize as we studied more was that, oh, wait, there's still a lot of injustice and inequality. And so, but this generation is not going to have a time when they think, oh, it's all great. It's like, no, it's all really broken. So let's really try and fix it. And so I think that's really, that's very exciting. And even I'll give you just a personal anecdote. What's really exciting is how activated kids are now. So for example, I can tell you our 10-year-old, when she was 9 last year during the national elections, her friends all calculated when the first election was they could vote in. They're like, so when do we get to weigh in, right, on this? And they all were talking about, wait, your birthday's after November, so you have to wait another cycle. And she has an early birthday, so she's like, I get to vote earlier this month, and so I was blown away by that, because when I was 9, that's not what I was thinking about. When do I get to vote next, right? And so I think there's an encouraging story there to say that kids are getting more and more activated and invested and focused on, hey, we've got to, make this country what we need it to be.
I would agree with that. I would also follow up just to piggyback off of what they said. I guess aligning with children's voices, or at least allowing them to have voice, means that we as attorneys and as law professors have to encourage our students to represent children, to be prepared and able to represent children in court, to treat them as they would any other client. And also to consider impact litigation on their behalf. And so if we think about the lessons that we learned from other rights movements, in addition to marching and protesting and sit-ins, there were lawsuits. And you have to have them kind of going hand in hand, because otherwise the laws that we have on the books don't change unless we push to get them off or push to, pass new ones. And sometimes that happens in the legislature. So that means that legislatures or legislative representatives need to allow for children to speak. To them, they are not necessarily a voting bloc, as we said before, nor do they have a lot of money to donate. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be listened to, and that the things that they are desiring to happen shouldn't be taken seriously. But in order for them to be taken seriously, they have to be given voice, and the court would need to take them, seriously. So if we think about the Brown v. Board of Education case, that those were children who were plaintiffs. They're represented, either through their parents, but they were given voice in the court. And I think the only way that we can really push these matters is if we basically teach our students to allow them that freedom of expression that we don't necessarily see, because we don't have the UNCRC passed in our country. But that doesn't mean that we can't, I guess, encourage or promote children being represented in court, just like they're present in all of these different movements, in the streets. We need to have them be represented in court as well, so that we can have some impact litigation that changes the narrative for them. So I would just add that as something that we can do.
Very inspiring, and thank you. And I know it's 2:28, so I'm going to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to come back to you and ask you in just a second, after Joe gives a little plug for the next sort of event on this kind of child rights journey, for one thing, this is to answer Cassie's question, one thing you would recommend folks do if they want to continue to be engaged around this issue of child rights. Is there an organization you suggest? Is there an effort that they can take? So I'll come back to you after you can think about that for a little bit, while Joe talks about what's coming next, and then we'll close up.
Great, thank you, Elliot. And what's coming next in this series of conversations is on November 8th during the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, which will be taking place in Glasgow. We will host a conversation on our duties to children and future generations. We've talked today with US legal scholars. That will be mostly a conversation with global scholars from across multiple disciplines, who have worked on the forefront of really at the intersection of rights, duties to future generations, and also climate justice. So you will not want to miss that conversation on November 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can, as always, find more information on that at capita.org/events. Elliot?
Great, thanks, Joe. All right, so I'm just going to go around the horn of people that I see in my thing. So, Dean Holly Walker, what would you say to folks? What should they be thinking about?
Oh my gosh, this is a tough question. One thing to do, I would just say, be active in some way. So, whether it is understanding who your local school board candidates are, and supporting people who have policies that are aligned with you. So taking local action, I believe local action is very important, action at the state level. But I would also say, become a supporter of the Child Rights Amendment, right? And whether you see yourself as supporting children's rights at the federal level, in the education space, in the healthcare space, economic equity, climate change, pick one of those things that is closest to you and raise them with your representatives. It's interesting that, as I said, I feel like education especially has been very much taken off the agenda at the federal level. And I think it is up to those of us who are concerned about this issue to put it back in the central part of our political agenda.
Thank you. Professor Tadros?
Sure. I guess I would say for whatever organization you work for, or if it's a community-based organization that you volunteer with, ask yourself what it would mean to take children's rights seriously in that organization, right? What has to change in the way you do business day to day? Does that mean you need a youth advisory board? Or does it mean something more? Does it mean when you design your research agenda, you should be speaking with children and youth to understand what they're concerned about before you even start with your research agenda? I think one of the real challenges for us, those of us who are interested in children's rights, is thinking about what must change in the way we do business day to day, because the answer can't be no change necessary. And so that's what I'd encourage people to think about.
Thank you. Professor Dixon Weaver?
So this is a hard question. I would say specifically, and this is, most children don't see, or they're not born seeing differences. And so I think maybe the way that they're best able to achieve change, particularly with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, the difference was all the different races of people who were marching. And so to the extent that we have some influence on, what is this narrative about critical race theory in K through 12, really it is sort of a pushback on truth in history and truth in what has happened in our country. And I think if children were given the truth, then they probably would be more aligned than they would draw differences like adults have drawn. And so to the extent that we can allow them to maintain some unity among themselves and not to draw false, lines to separate themselves, whether it's by race or sexual orientation, I think that their strength will be derived in their unity. So to the extent that we can fight back on, a push that does not allow them to learn the truth about our country so that they can be aligned in the future, I think we should do that. So that's something that we can all do. We know these things are existent in our, whether it's in the school system or on the state level, we should fight back against that.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Professor Robinson.
Yeah, I think this is a great question to end on. And I would say for people who are parents out there or supporting children's rights, I would say get involved in organizations of coalitions that are building around this issue. In particular, there's quite a few parent coalitions that I'm seeing that are getting born and that are really making headway. And you get a bunch of angry, motivated parents, you can get a whole lot of things done. And so I think that they have a lot of potential to get things done at the local, state, and eventually the national level. I think as you see, movement at the and lower levels, those things will eventually ripple up. So I do think there are just a variety of coalitions out there that are building momentum around this issue. I know because they contacted me and they want me to kind of explain the legal landscape to them and talk with them about what's possible. And so there are definitely organizations out there that are building momentum to advance the rights of children and particularly the right to education.
Great. That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much. Thank you for giving us 4 extra minutes of your time. I really appreciate it. This is a inspiring and fascinating conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing it with everyone who's listening in, everyone who is here, because there are few issues I think more important for the president and for the future of the children in this country than the state of their rights. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. You have a wonderful rest of the day, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.